Welcome, everybody. I'm David Lewis. I'm the president of the Midwest Public Administration Caucus. As many of you know, the caucus is organized to foster the scientific study of the bureaucracy, and it does that through two primary activities. One is the organization of panels. At the Midwest Conference, and this year, Professor Chris Kerrigan from George Washington organized a couple of terrific roundtables, one yesterday, and there'll be another one tomorrow at 1:15. And the second thing that the caucus does is it awards the Herbert Simon Award to a scholar for their contributions to the scientific study of the bureaucracy, and provides an opportunity for the winner of that award to give the Herbert Simon Lecture. So that's the primary activity tonight. I want to let you know a little bit about, in terms of business, things that are coming. So Professor Stefan Lavertu will become the president after this meeting. Stefan can't be here tonight, but he'll be doing this next year. And like I said, the primary item on the agenda for tonight is to award the Herbert Simon Award. And to do that, we have Professor Pam McCann from, she's an assistant professor at the Saul Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California. Her book, Federal Design Dilemma, Congress and Intergovernmental Delegation, came out last year. Basically last year from Cambridge University Press. So buy it. She's terrific, and she's going to do this job.
Thank you, Dave. So I wrote this down so I wouldn't mess up. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you. The Herbert Simon Award of the Midwest Political Science Association Public Administration Caucus is given annually to the scholar based on his or her career achievements in the scientific study of bureaucracy. The award committee was chaired by Sandy Gordon, myself, and Matt Petoksky were also members, and we agreed on, before we decided on who the award winner would be, we agreed on 3 selection criteria prior to even looking at what ended up being a really robust and amazing pool of nominees. And the 3 criteria included the overall impact of the nominee's contribution to the study of bureaucracy, the intellectual merit of the nominee's contribution, and the extent to which both 1 and 2 applied specifically to the study of the bureaucracy. With these 3 criteria in mind, the committee is pleased to announce its unanimous decision that this year's award be given to Charles Shipan, the J. Ira and Nikki Harris Professor of Social Sciences, Professor of Public Policy, and he is no longer chair of the Department of Political Science. I didn't put that part in there. I knew that he wasn't. So Professor Shipan has made significant, long-lasting, and intellectually meritorious contributions to the scientific study of bureaucracy in not 1, but 2 areas of research. The first of these is legislative delegation to and control of bureaucratic agencies. He both in solo and joint authored work deftly blends rigorous theoretical modeling and empirical analysis to examine the extent to which bureaucracies can act autonomously from their political principles and the conditions under which those principles will apply tools, such as constraining statutory language, to bring them to heel. In several highly cited articles, Shipan, with co-author Craig Bolden, also introduced the previously neglected features of the political environment into the study of how policy innovations spread vertically between levels of government and horizontally across them. And they arrive at subtler, more institutionally contingent view of diffusion processes not previously appreciated. Although not part of our selection criteria, but a trait that I have had the opportunity to experience myself, Chuck is also an incredible mentor for not just his own grad students and junior faculty, but also others in the field broadly. He engages with us on important ideas and gets excited about interesting, well-done, and often hard-fought work in ways that inspire and make the study of delegation and public administration and the bureaucracy and political institutions not just stronger in our own individual research projects, but also show us how this subfield has a vitality, an evolution, and a forward trajectory, and when we build on each other's work, when we challenge our assumptions and our conventional wisdom, that this subfield's not just a crucial piece of governance, but it's also just a heck of a lot of fun to do. So, Chuck, I have
All right. Well, thank you very much, Pam, and the committee. This is really a wonderful honor. I am deeply, deeply grateful to receive it, especially given the company that it puts me in, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. Several years ago, I was at a concert in Ann Arbor, and the singer started talking about a song he had written, which was a song about baseball, and he was approached by a record company, and the record company said, hey, we're putting together a CD of songs about baseball. Would you like to put this song on it? And he said, no, why? I don't want to do that. I'm not interested. Why? Who else is on it? And they said, oh, Bruce Springsteen has agreed to do it, and Bob Dylan has agreed to do it, and John Fogerty. He said, yeah, I would actually like to be on that CD. And it led to him being able to, for the rest of the show, talk about, and so this song, it's not like the one that's on the me and Springsteen and Dylan CD, because there's other songs I've done, but this one that's me and Springsteen and Dylan. So I feel a little bit that way right now, winning this award, that it's an award where now the winners of the Simon Award include me and Dave Lewis and George Krause and Terry Moe and Barry Weingast and Johan Olsen and Gary Miller. And wow. That makes me feel really good. That's some really good company. It also got me thinking a little bit about, it also puts me very remotely in the company of Herbert Simon. So I need to figure out where to stand here. I'll stand here. Okay? And so I started thinking about the things that we can claim now. So one thing we can do is we can talk about our combined awards and honors. Between the two of us now, we have a Nobel Prize in Economics, the Turing Prize, National Academy of Sciences, the National Medal of Science. I will note there are only 2 political scientists to get that. Von Neumann Theory Prize, some lifetime achievements, some honorary doctorates, and now the Herbert Simon Award. To say a little bit more, the other thing I thought about doing is that when you look at Simon's accomplishments, well, it's me and Simon. That's right. We're talking about me and Simon. Together, we combine for 329,000 citations on Google Scholar. Now, you might be thinking that, yeah, that's mostly Herbert Simon. And it turns out you're right. So that's me. But you know what? I don't care, because we still combine for 329,000 sites. The other thing I did, and this was just kind of out of curiosity, I was wondering which active political scientists are the most cited. And it's Google Scholar, so take it with a grain of salt. But it turns out Bob Putnam is far and away the most cited of active political scientists. And still, Simon has almost twice as many sites as Putnam. And the next set after Putnam would include Ron Engelhardt and Bob Axelrod and Sid Verba, Bob Cohane. And you can combine a bunch of them. I mean, these are luminaries, right? And you can combine a bunch of them. And the Shipan and Simon combination still clearly beats them. Anyway, I think we make a good team. This is partly just a sort of a joking way of pointing out just what an enormous contributor Simon was, to show how prominent he was and to indicate how pleased I am to receive this award. I do have one last story to say about Simon, which is that when I was in graduate school, one of my fields was organizations. We were allowed to create our own field. And so I created this study where I took courses in sociology and political science and the business school. And of course, Herbert Simon's work is at the center of all of that. And so then my first job interview was at Carnegie Mellon. This was in, God, when was this? Doesn't matter, a long time ago. And when I got there, I was really excited to meet him. And so in the morning, I met with one of the first faculty members and I asked, does Herbert Simon still show up for things? Is he active in the department? And the guy said, yeah, he's actually a really wonderful colleague. You know, given what a prominent person he is, it's kind of amazing. He shows up and he participates and he goes to everything that happens. He's a great colleague. And I said, does he ever go to job talks? And they said, he does. And that it's really wonderful watching him there, because He'll just, who he is, he could dominate the thing, but he doesn't. He'll just ask a question or two, and other people will ask questions, and then Herb will ask another question, and then other people ask questions, then Herb will ask another question, and then you sit there in the audience and you realize that little by little, in this incredibly professional, collegial, friendly way, he has dismantled the person's entire argument. This is my first meeting of the day on my first job talk. I went immediately from thinking, oh, I hope he's there, to walking into the room and looking around to make sure nobody looked like that. So, anyway, okay. So let me now get to the topic of today's talk, which is about bureaucracy and black boxes. Okay, I'll get to the roadmap in a second. This was motivated in part by a talk that Andy Whitford gave last year when he received this award. And the title of Andy's talk was The Deconstruction of the American State. And it was a smart and thoughtful and timely talk. And a lot of the ideas that he touched on in there, I think, if anything, have grown in importance and resonance since then. But one of the things that he talked about has stuck with me. And it's something that wasn't central to his talk, but it was something that he touched on. And it was the notion of about blackboxing bureaucracies and about why blackboxing bureaucracies, rather focusing in on them, can be a negative thing. Can they have really detrimental effects? Okay, so I agreed with this in part. I mean, Andy's really smart and he made a lot of good points. There were other parts about it that I was a little bit less sure about. And so when I found out about getting this honor, I thought this would give me the opportunity to spend a little bit more time thinking about this, okay, to give me a chance to explore it. So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to explore the benefits of, at least sometimes, thinking about blackboxing bureaucracies. Okay, so the roadmap, I want to let you know what we're going to do. First thing I want to talk about is, what do we know about black boxes and bureaucracies? The second thing is, what are the justifications for sometimes blackboxing bureaucracies, or are there any? The third thing is, I want to show a bunch of examples. So the answer is yes, I think there are justifications. And then I'm going to show some examples of how I think that blackboxing, at least initially, has led to some really significant contributions to our understanding of bureaucracy. Okay. So what do we know about black boxes? In particular, black boxes in the study of bureaucracy, but black boxes in general. One thing we know is that everybody wants to open them, okay? And you start looking for this, you start seeing it everywhere. So especially with reference to the bureaucracy, there are studies that talk about the need to open up the black box of bureaucracy overall, especially with regard to policy implementation. We need to open up that black box. There are recent studies about opening up the black box of racially representative bureaucracies, or opening up the black box of decision-making of street-level bureaucrats. So basically, in political science, not just bureaucracy, we see this all the time too. Political scientists talk about opening up the black box of Latin American party organizations, gender interactions, juries, Soviet-type economies, geopolitical ordering, and more and more. Okay? It's not just political science. There are related disciplines that are also always talking about unpacking the black box, about mentoring, mental health, leadership, cognition, social services, and on again. So this is a really common thing. It's not just bureaucracy that talks about, it's not just people who study bureaucracy who say we need to unpack this. This is a general theme in the social sciences. But I really do want to focus on it in bureaucracy. And the reason is that we talk a lot, there are lots and lots of open black boxes in the social sciences, in political science, and in general. What's interesting to me about it is, first, we know that there are a lot of these trends towards opening the black box. Second, we also know that there are some costs. There is no doubt there are some costs of black boxing. There's actually a chapter that George and Ken Meyer wrote about 15 years ago in the edited volume you guys put together. that does a really nice job. That chapter is aged remarkably well, talking about why we need to unpack some of the things about bureaucracies that people have simply ignored. And so we know that there are certain costs to it, but what there hasn't been is very much discussion of whether it's ever justified to use black boxes or to treat bureaucracy as a black box, whether there's ever a reason that there would be benefits from it, whether there's ever a reason to do this. Okay, when might we want to do it? And so that's what I want to explore. Okay, if we talk about justifications then for why there might be black box, why we might sometimes black box bureaucracies, I think it's important to start by recognizing that, first of all, there are really obvious benefits to opening the black box. So I'm not even slightly saying, don't do that. I'm just simply saying that that's a really useful thing to do. Might we gain some benefits from sometimes treating bureaucracy as a black box? What are some of these benefits? One of them is we learn a lot about specific agencies. So we learn about how the FCC works, or we learn about how the Forest Service works, or we learn about how police operate, or we learn about how schools work. In addition, we learn about specific aspects of those agencies. So we can learn about how professionalism operates within an agency, or about rulemaking, or about adjudication. We don't know a whole lot about adjudication right now, or about the span of control, or about the development of expertise. So we learn a lot about those specific things. We also, in the best cases, can learn about politics more generally. In here, I'm thinking we learn about how policy is made, or why we get some policies and not others. But more than that, what I'm thinking about here is that we learn about both the extent of power of other political institutions and about the limits of those power. And if we start learning those things along with how policy is made, we can think about progressing from that. We're sort of brick by brick, we put these things together to create this new scaffolding, this new understanding of things. Okay, and that leads to the last point, why it's a benefit to open these, is that looking within black boxes, and this is a standard point in the philosophy of science, looking within black boxes provides better understanding and comprehension. It directs our attention to mechanisms, to micro-foundations, and to things like that that really enhance our overall understanding. So there are more things we could point to. That's a pretty good list, going from the most concrete to the most general. So now, what are the justifications for sometimes using black boxes? Well, the first one, I would just call practical considerations. And here the idea is that there's always another black box, okay? There are boxes within boxes within boxes. And we are always black boxing things. Whether we are aware of it or not, whether we recognize that we're doing it, we're always doing this. Suppose, for example, the study is that we're doing some sort of study that includes bureaucracy, and someone points out that, wait a second, you've just abstracted away from all of the hierarchy within the agency. And hierarchies are very important. We've known that for a very long time, and you don't have it in there. Okay, and perhaps by incorporating hierarchy, you would gain new insights, or you might even get different conclusions once you start including that. Okay, that's a fair point. So you can focus on hierarchy and put hierarchy in your model. Then someone else can come back and say, wait a second, not all hierarchies are the same. Hierarchy operates differently in this agency from this agency. Or within hierarchies, you can have different features, different spans of control, for example. Okay? So now you think, well, okay, we'll add span of control into the model. Good. Somebody else points out, but once you do that, that might affect who works in these agencies, right? You might get different mixes of careerists and appointees, or you might get different sorts of professionals who come into play, okay? And on, and on, and on. At some point, we're always figuring out somewhere to draw a line and to say, we're going to look at the things above here and we're not going to look at the other things. Okay, the couple points just to repeat there. The first is that we always have to abstract away from some really potentially interesting things that other people are certainly going to find interesting and think are missing. We have to be able to justify why we're doing that, But the fact remains we do that all the time. The second is that we have different explanatory concerns and different ideas that we're pursuing at different times. Sometimes bureaucracy is the main focus. Sometimes bureaucracy is not the only focus of what we're doing, or even the main focus. And I would say this is especially true in situations where we're looking at interactions among different institutions, interactions among different branches of government. Okay? So especially when you want to focus on these system level ideas, these system level aspects of bureaucracy, you end up, institutions, you end up having to black box something. A key thing is we can disagree about which things should be black boxed. And I think that's where the appropriate disagreement is. But the fact is, we have to black box some of them. Okay, so those are practical considerations. I want to talk about some more abstract considerations for a little bit. And these are conceptual reasons for why we can benefit from focusing on the bureaucracy. And I want to start somewhat surprisingly, I guess, by talking about Simon's work himself. So if you were to ask random political scientists, what is Herbert Simon known for? Almost certainly they would name two things: satisficing bounded rationality. Okay? And that's true. Those are major contributions. He used those to build theories of administration and organization, but I would point to something different, actually. I would point to the idea that he brings up of premises. And the idea of premises is that there are, that these are decisions that can be made, no, let me start it over. These are that decisions in organizations are made based on specific premises. Okay? And these premises can come about from earlier decisions that are made elsewhere. And they affect actions and outcomes. So by changing the premises upon which somebody is making their decisions, and these are value premises in some cases, and these are factual premises in other cases, you can affect the actions and outcomes of those decisions. Okay? And in addition to that, the way you can do this is by controlling the information that people have when they're making decisions, or controlling the set of outcomes that they're choosing among. So Simon starts with this model of individual limits in terms of decision making, and then says the way that organizations deal with this is by limiting the premises or defining the premises on which people are making decisions. And that has all sorts of positive repercussions in Simon's view for how organizations work. It's an incredibly powerful idea. It's just an incredible insight, I think. And so it's something that I think finds resonance in a lot of later work. A key thing, though, is that it means that any decisions that people are making in organizations are being constrained or defined by others. And in particular, these others can be outside of the organization, and in the case of bureaucracy, they often are. So it's often the case that courts are setting the premises upon which agencies can make decisions, or that Congress is doing so, or that the president is doing so. Okay, so this idea can be overdone, right? The idea that what agencies do is defined by actors outside of the organization. It certainly can be taken too far, and it has. And I'm not saying that Simon himself says that to understand what agencies do, you have to look outside of the agency. At the same time, Simon did write, in public administration, final responsibility for determining objectives, these are premises, rests with a legislative body. So he acknowledges that there are these benefits for looking outside of the agency. And this, I think, provides a justification for why, if we want to understand the actions of bureaucrats, it's useful to look outside of the agency itself. Okay, so that's one piece in terms of this abstract reasoning. The second piece draws more on philosophy of science. And in here, in particular, we need to think about the difference between prediction and understanding. Okay? Blackboxing allows for the former. It's better at allowing for the former, at allowing for prediction. Whereas looking inside the black box, philosophers of science would say, is better for understanding. It allows for more and deeper understanding and comprehension. I think that's generally right, with a couple of different caveats. The first is Roald Hoffmann is a Nobel Prize chemist. And he has written a lot about this. He's thought about this, what level should we be looking at? How deeply should we be digging into things? And what he argues is that going deeper and deeper can be a good thing. And it can lead to good science. And it can lead to new insights and new discoveries. He says it doesn't necessarily produce better knowledge by doing that. It just produces different knowledge from doing that. And what his worry is, and this gets into something we can talk about later, this idea of a reductionist hypothesis in science where you keep reducing things down. But what he worries is that a scientist who keeps focusing in on narrower and narrower things might lose the ability to solve broader sort of problems and address broader sorts of issues. And so he advocates drawing a line where you're going to focus on the things above this line and not worry as much about the things below this line. I want to be careful. I'm not saying don't pay attention to bureaucracy. I'm just saying that within philosophy of science, there are some who say, no, it's not necessarily this understanding versus prediction only. The second thing is prediction and understanding aren't really mutually exclusive. Okay, so that's the simple point. The third one is that focusing on understanding itself just isn't always that clear cut. So we can say that, oh yes, we should open the black box and focus on understanding. And we should do that. We should focus on mechanisms because that's what everybody wants to do is focus on mechanisms and micro foundations now. Again, very good things. But it's not clear exactly what that means. John Gehring wrote a really nice political theory article about half dozen years ago in which he pointed this out. He said, everybody wants to study mechanisms. Turns out everybody means something slightly differently by that. And everybody also wants to study different mechanisms. And it's a thoughtful piece, and it argues for coalescing around certain ideas. But it points out that it can be hard to know what exactly we should be focusing on. And I think that you get benefit from looking within a black box, but within an overall structure, which is a point I'll get back to in just a second. The last thing I want to do in talking about, second to last thing I want to do when I'm talking about this is I want to borrow from a comment that I read about an article that was talking about this issue, in which someone wrote, and this is in response to, there's a philosopher named Michael Strevens at NYU, and he writes a lot about black boxes, and one of the commenters on him mentioned that, here's how to think about a black box. A black box rarely gives a view into an entire world. Rather, it's a hole in the fence, telling us that there is much more to see if only we climb the fence. Okay? And so it provides a partial view, and we can then build on that partial view and hopefully expand it into a more complete view. Okay. I mentioned Michael Strevens, and I want to talk just a little bit more about what he says, because he is a skeptic of the use of black boxes in social inquiry or in science in general. But he does allow that there is a reason for using black boxes at times. And in particular, what he says is you use them if you want to trade off some accuracy for some generality. And that is the big reason to use it. Now, it's tricky, because his argument is that you can do this then when large amounts of generality can be obtained with a small sacrifice in accuracy. When that is the case, the trade-off should be made. Okay, large and small are pretty subjective here, right? And the key thing is we often don't know what the sizes are of these trade-offs. And that would be the argument against black boxing, is that the trade-offs aren't worth it. But he continues, and he says that if you want to use black boxes because you think the trade-off will be worth it, you need to do a couple things. The first is you need to do it within an explanatory framework, because that gives your theory predictive power and some understanding. The second thing is that it, quote, this provides the schema for the individual case-by-case explanations. Okay? So black boxes can be worth it if the trade-off is worth it. They work best when you have an explanatory framework that provides you a schema that you can use for investigating things within the black box. Okay. He then digs into an example which looks at population ecology. And he makes a few points that I think actually correspond pretty well to the study of institutions and bureaucracy. And the first of these is that black boxing makes models more modular, which makes them easier to handle. Okay? The second point is that it enables economy through specialization. He writes that rather than every ecologist having to know something about everything, different scientists can focus on different levels of description. Third, he says that distinct explanations may have common parts. So population ecologists are looking at predators and preys. Okay? You don't know that if a rabbit is going to be the same as, if it's prey, as a fox would be as prey, or as humans would be as prey. But as long as they have something in common with each other, and again, think to bureaucracy, at a higher level, then it can make sense to abstract away from these differences and to capture the similarities using a more abstract representation. When these things hold, he says, black boxes can be a natural approach. Okay, again, I would say that the study of bureaucracy is a pretty close parallel, maybe not perfect, but a pretty close parallel to this. There are many studies that focus just on bureaucracy and provide all sorts of insights, just as there are studies of rabbits and studies of foxes and studies of people. Okay? But there are also studies that are done at more of a system level. And this, in part, fits with Simon's emphasis that there are decision premises that can be set and that they can be set from outside the bureaucracy. These things then create schemas. They create frameworks that we can use, explanatory frameworks, and that they can also produce responses then from people who are more expert in the part that has been black box. So you create this schema, you create this framework, you provide this level of understanding, and you get response from people who are these experts in the areas that are being black boxed. Okay? Again, their response is structured by what the overall models have had to say, and they can respond about what's missing. And then decisions can be made about whether those things should be incorporated into future models. Okay? I think this is a pretty good analog to how work has proceeded on bureaucracy. I think it has led to insights about institutions generally, and I think that it has actually led to insights about bureaucracy in particular. And so what I want to do now in this last part of the talk, which might go on for a little bit, and I apologize, is I want to talk about some examples of how I have seen this work. And I'm going to focus on 4 areas that I've been especially interested in over time: structures and procedures, appointments, delegation, and oversight and influence. Okay, so let's start with structures and procedures. Here, there's different stories we could tell about how this literature has evolved. It's actually really striking to go back and read older classic work, Robert Cushman's work on agencies. There's some work by Seymour Scherr, I don't know how you say his last name, Scherr, I guess, in the early 1960s. These things were remarkably prescient in anticipating some of the things that came up in later work. But 2 of the things that generally we would point to right now as setting this foundation would be Terry Moe's work on the politics of structural choice and the various McNoll-Gast articles. And these 2 pieces, Moe's and McNoll-Gast, say very little about agencies themselves. Okay, they're primarily about how the systems are designed, how structures and processes can be put in place by political principles. Okay, so that's good, but it really does black box bureaucracy. So what has that led to? Well, here I'm going to point to what I think is I'm going to highlight some really exciting new work that's been done recently by Rachel Potter in both a book project and in a series of papers. And the point that she makes here is that, and this won't come as a surprise to anyone in this room, but it's that agencies have agency. That agencies can take actions, and in particular, it's the very structures and procedures that principals can put in place that are meant to constrain the agency that they can use to protect themselves or that they can use to their advantage overall. Okay, and so she shows how agencies can be strategic about this. Okay, here, for example, is a list of different agencies and the length of the comment period that they allow. Turns out agencies have a lot of latitude in how long to allow comments to come in. Turns out also, there's variation in that. Turns out also that they're strategic about how they do that. You can also look, and this was in a paper she published recently, at the amount of time agencies take to finalize their rules. Okay? Sometimes they finalize them really quickly. Sometimes they take a lot longer to do it. They slow roll it or fast track it. Okay? And you speed up if you think that the climate is favorable. And if you think the climate is not favorable, you slow down, waiting for it to be more favorable when you put into place your final rule. Okay. This shows a really nice turnabout from an initial set of studies that talked about these structures and procedures purely from the point of view of political principles, but then it opened up the question of, so what do agencies do with all this? And it turns out they can use them themselves. Another study has put, recent study has put a refreshing twist on another aspect of structure and procedures, which is the fire alarm model. And like Potter's study, what this one does is it says agencies are not just simply reactive, they're not simply passive. And this is a paper that Kate Bradley and Jake Hasselschwartz just published in the recent Journal of Public Policy. And the basic question they ask is, when do government agencies try to enlist the aid of interest groups to lobby the legislature? Okay? That's really interesting. It flips the whole thing around, right? The whole fire alarm model is based on the idea that agencies are there, and they're kind of looking over their shoulder all the time, worried about what groups are going to do. And this says, you know, sure, maybe that happens, but agencies also go out and they talk to these groups and they try to enlist their aid. They engage in what the paper calls indirect bureaucratic lobbying. And it draws on interviews from Bradley's dissertation, which started out, I think, with a really amusing thing, which is, you know, if you're wondering whether bureaucrats ever lobby interest groups to go lobby Congress, and you ask the bureaucrats' standard response is, no, we don't do that because that would be wrong. We don't do that. Okay, that's fine. If you go and ask the interest groups, on the other hand, they say things like, absolutely. Okay? The agencies will say, if I were doing this, this might be something I would look at. They're that direct about it. They're really good and very clear. We get encouragement. It's pretty blunt. What's really nice then is, as in the earlier study I mentioned, you can look to see when agencies do this and when they don't. And what they find is that these requests are a function of a couple different things. One is whether or not the governor is hostile to the program of the agency. Okay? If so, the agencies are looking for allies. The other is that it actually turns out that the agency's overall capacity and performance matters. But the way it matters is that as agency performance decreases, it makes it more likely that they're going to turn to interest groups for help, which, if you think about it, makes sense. Okay. What about appointments? Okay, so here's another area where we can start with looking at some very stark models. We can think about Tom Hammond and Jeff Hill have a model in which it's a simple spatial model looking at the president and the Senate and looking to see who gets approved to head agencies. Calvert and McCubbins and Weingast have a model that's more about agency policy making, but the central aspect of it is about the idea of who gets appointed, because that's how they can control what policy the agency is going to do. Again, very little about agencies in these models. Okay, that's not quite fair. They allow for agency discretion. Okay, so agencies can have discretion in these, and that ends up mattering. And they produce some really nice insights with this about the role of uncertainty, about why the Senate almost always approves nominees, about why the amount of discretion an agency has can affect who gets nominated and who gets approved. But it's really not about the internal workings of agencies. So a big step forward came with some work that Dave did, looking at appointments and saying that, okay, there are other things going on. Agencies vary, for example, by competence. And they also vary by how politicized they are. And presidents can take advantage of those differences across agencies and thinking about how they want to politicize them. More recently, there's some working papers that Christina Kinane has been doing as part of her dissertation that include a lot of nuance about bureaucracy and about the president. So it's the same framework as earlier studies. President chooses a nominee, Senate can veto that nomination, and it includes some other aspects of bureaucracy. But it takes a couple notable steps forward. The first one is it looks at the set of considerations a president has, and it says it's not just who do we choose to nominate, it's more about having multiple options. And in particular, a president can choose a nominee, can leave a position open, or can decide to put an interim person in place. Okay? If the president has all of those options, do we see that happening? A little bit hard to see here. The colors didn't turn out. This is in the Trump administration, and we know that the Trump administration has left a lot of positions empty. That's this sort of, it should be green. No, it should be orange. What the heck? It's this middle category here. And we see that in some agencies, there's a whole lot of interims right now in place. We also see that there are a lot of agencies, or those are the empty ones, I'm sorry. There are a whole lot that have major proportions that are interims, okay? There are some that have filled a lot of positions in the VA, 75% filled. Others, like education, only 27% have been confirmed. Okay, so we know that there's this variation in the Trump administration, but it turns out, and I just know this next one's not going to show up well, but there we go. Okay, this is a little bit complicated to look at, so just focus on the left side for now. This looks at whether the president has just chosen a nominee, or has put an interim in and then nominated someone, or has just put an interim in place. And again, we see over time there's a fair amount of variation in what goes on here, as well as a fair amount of variation in whether or not they leave these positions empty. So there's something to explain there. There's something that the president has some extra strategies to use here that we should really know something about. In addition, and this gets more into the bureaucracy aspect of it, not all positions are the same. Some positions are high-skilled positions that can have really big effects on what the agency is doing, and others are lower-skilled positions. Some nominees are highly capable, and other nominees are not so capable. And so by incorporating these things into a standard framework, it allows you to come up with some new insights about how nominations and appointments work. And she finds some very interesting things. One of the ones that I think really stands out is if presidents want to contract an agency, they will not submit a nominee for confirmation. Instead, if it's a low-skilled position, what they'll end up doing is they'll fill that with an interim appointee right away. And if it's a high-skilled position, they'll leave it empty. Interestingly, even if the Senate, like the president, wants contraction, they will still go ahead and leave that empty. All right, let's talk about delegation. Okay, here are lots of studies on delegation. A lot of them have been very prominent in helping us understand all sorts of aspects of delegation. The standard view is Congress decides to delegate, and so then we should focus on how much delegation, how much discretion, and so on. And so now in the second plug for Pam's book today, sales are just going to spike after this today, Pam. What it turns out is that we live in a federal system, okay? Most studies of delegation just ignore that. But when Congress is making a decision about whether to delegate, they're also making a decision about where to delegate. Do you delegate at the national level or do you delegate down to the state level? And as it turns out, there are some, about 20%, I think, of cases in which delegation is done primarily to the national level. But as we move up the side to the proportional joint, we find that a bigger percentage of provisions in a lot of laws are actually joint. They delegate both to state and federal agencies at the same time, and very few are to just state-level agencies. And so this is striking. I mean, this is based on coding thousands of provisions over 4 decades and looking to see what it looks like. And her primary goal then is to say, why does Congress do this? And she finds some interesting things. For example, there's big variations in, so this top line, easiest way to look at it is this top line is the percentage of provisions that are national delegations. And they're the things we would expect: foreign trade, international affairs, defense, banking and commerce. But there are others in which we see much more delegation to the states. For example, housing and education and things like that. And so what she does is she wants to explain why this happens, and she looks at this theoretically and empirically and impressively. And she finds a number of interesting findings about when you would be likely to do this. But what I think is important here is it points out a few things. One is we should be paying more attention to state level agencies. So this is not a case where it's showing new things about agencies, but it's telling us new things about agencies we should study. A second is that we have these major differences across agencies. And so why is that? Why does Congress make those choices? A third thing is a little bit more subtle. It's this realization that when you are delegating, when we're looking at delegation in federal agencies, we should keep in mind that that's a biased set of possible issues that they're dealing with, right? That Congress has decided, you can deal with these, but you can't deal with these other ones. And that's something I think we should take into account. Another study that also incorporates federalism is something that Elizabeth Mann has worked on, which is presidential policy making at the state level. And in particular, what she's interested in is looking at waivers. So waivers are when agencies at the national level decide to allow states to be exempt from certain qualifications and requirements in the law. And what Mann finds is that it turns out there's a fair amount. Nice. Turns out there's a fair. Uh-oh. Why is it stuck? Okay. Let's go back to that. Start from current slide. Nah, I was hoping that one would work. Okay. What I can't show you is the scale, but this is the number of approved waivers in the area of education. The earlier one was Medicaid and welfare. Okay. The scale here is hundreds. Okay. So in these latter years, I think those are, and correct me if I'm wrong, Elizabeth, like 300-400 different approvals of waivers. Okay, so there are lots of waivers being approved. And it turns out this is a function of agreement and disagreement between the executive branch and Congress, and between the executive branch and what the expectation is about the overall number of states that would be on board with these policies. There's a third area that I would point to in delegation that also incorporates the federalist aspect, but it actually goes in a different direction, and this is something that Chinu Paranandi has done, in which he looks at delegation to agencies in the area of AFDC. And what he points out is that some agencies are given high levels of discretion. So this is a paper that came out a few years ago in SPPQ. Some agencies are given high levels of discretion, other agencies are given very low levels of discretion. But what we find is that the agencies that are given high levels of discretion are the ones that learn from other agencies. They are the ones that become part of a diffusion network. So there's all sorts of interesting positive and normative implications of that. Okay, we're still working. Hang on, we've got about 4 more slides to get through here. Okay, now let's talk about influence and oversight. And this is maybe the toughest one to talk about here. And the reason is Andy in his talk last year referred back to the horrors of the congressional dominance era. And so this might be the hardest one to defend as having had a positive aspect in this crowd. But what the heck, you know? The standard view is that there was this argument with some people, Weingast in particular, saying that's congressional dominance, and others, mainly people who study agencies, saying no, you don't know anything about agencies, it's agency autonomy. I would point out there's a third aspect here that sometimes gets pushed to the side, and it's Terry Moe's work, which is that it's presidents that dominate. He doesn't use the word dominate, but He has an earlier article in which it's, I forget the title, Regulatory Performance and Presidential Influence or something, where he's just looking at the president's influence and saying that's what drives agencies. So you've got all three of these that are staking out really strong positions. Did they go too far? Sure, of course they did. And it unfortunately took on a bit of a, does to, does not, does to, does not sort of flavor. But I would say it has ended up being really productive. And it's been productive in that models started paying attention to each side started paying attention to some of the criticisms that were being leveled from other sorts of approaches. And they started incorporating some of these things, maybe not as fast as people would like, but they did. One of them took place almost within the next few years, I guess, and it's still one of my favorite articles ever. It's Terry Moe's article on control and feedback at the NLRB. Okay? It's a wonderful article that starts incorporating some of these different ideas. And it's led to, these studies have led to a focus in general on why bureaucrats have autonomy and what they do with the autonomy. This is something that I've been interested in and looked at. Denise Lilvis at the University of Buffalo has a series of papers now looking at this in a really interesting context, which is a lot of agencies are filled with professionals. And so when professionals are in a situation, in her case the professionals are they're public health professionals who are engaging in setting vaccine policies, for example. And what do? She asks. If they're in a situation, say, of divided government, does that make them more likely to be very proactive in pursuing public health goals, or does that make them more hesitant to do it? I think it's a fascinating question, and it ties in a long-standing interest that bureaucracy has had on professionalism with these other sorts of concerns that emerge from these earlier studies. I would also mention that Rob McGrath has written a number of papers that are about ex post or oversight capabilities. In particular, one is about the relationship between ex ante and ex post influence, which too often gets swept to the side, which I have swept to the side often. And he says, are these complements or are they substitutes? And he shows formally they can be either. Okay, so they can reinforce each other at times. He's also, with Jason McDonald, in a really nice piece that I think came out last year or the year before, looked at the total amount of oversight hearing over time. And first of all, shows it happens a lot. So they don't quite say this, but they say, stop saying there's no police patrol oversight, because there's a lot of it. But what they look at is, why do we see some of this oversight under unified government? Okay, and they talk about it being a form of retrospective oversight, where you can look at policies that were put into effect by previous agencies. What's relevant, especially here, is that in another paper then, what McGrath has done is he has said, what effect do these hearings have on agencies? And that's one of the problems people have, is that it often doesn't have, talk about that effect. He ties it to agency morale. So he has information about agency morale and job satisfaction, and ties this together with the frequency and tone of agencies, of hearings, to show that these things can affect agency morale. Okay, couple of closing comments. The big question to ask here in all of what I'm saying, well, first of all, a reminder. I'm not saying don't open the black boxes, open them. Look inside and tell those of us who are not spending as much time doing that what things we should really be paying attention to. Second thing is, the fair question to ask about all of what I've said is, would we have gotten to these more recent studies if we did not have these earlier black box studies? That's a fair question. It's certainly possible. And I can't say that, no, we wouldn't have gotten any of them. But it seems unlikely to me. It seems unlikely to me because these earlier studies set these frameworks, set these schemas, set these patterns and explanatory frameworks within which we try to understand what bureaucracy is doing, which in turn leads to those who are specializing in it to highlight some of those features and to incorporate those into the models. So black boxes, for all their limitations, I think have led to some significant discoveries and insights. And I want to close just by saying thanks, first to the students that I've learned so much from, second to the teachers that I've had, which includes many of the people in this room, including the students, and third to the people that I've co-authored with on studies of the bureaucracy, which would include Fred Bemke, John Fairjohn, John Huber, Madeline Failer, and Rachel Potter. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions. George.
Your discussion about the black box sort of as the dichotomy or the cut point made me think of sort of a common distinction between public management and bureaucratic politics.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think normatively, from a positivist angle, should we be concerned about that and try to find ways to bridge it? Or should we just basically keep doing what we're doing where there's sort of two separate streams?
That's a great question. I think the way that I would approach that is I would want to know which are the distinctions that would be made between those different areas, and which of the things, like in public management, would be most relevant for a political understanding. To the extent that those are about political aspects, then I would say we want to draw from those. And there I see the sort of divergence between the two as being a bit of an issue, because if we're just focusing on one aspect and not the other, I think that we're missing something. What I'm less certain about, though, is to what extent the concerns of people who are writing in the public management area, and here I could be off base, so I'm happy to let somebody tell me this. I don't get the sense that people writing in that tradition are in as much a part of this broader conversation as people who are writing about bureaucracy and in the way, for example, that you would. And so I think that would be useful if they would do that, because I think the thing that any of the people who are putting forward different models want to know is, tell me what I'm missing and tell me why it should be included.
Yeah, because I think the reason why I asked that is because Andy's talk, which you're sort of the flip side of Andy's talk, is really coming from a public management
perspective. Yeah.
And this is a larger normative issue about how the field should develop.
Yeah.
Should they be on parallel tracks like they have been, or should they somehow converge whenever feasible?
Yeah. And as I mentioned earlier, his talk was about a broader and really important issue, the deconstruction of the state. And it is coming from more of a public management perspective. And so I think that's a really good point. Chris.
So I think maybe I'm trying to squeeze out even more career advice from you. Which is this. So you have laid out a number of examples of people who have opened up a black box and found really cool stuff inside.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But the world's full of boring black boxes.
Yeah.
Right? How do you know when you look at the box if it's worth opening?
Yeah, so I'm going to come at that a little bit indirectly, which is one of the things that I had in, believe it or not, there was a longer version of this talk. One of the things that I had in there was this issue of when do you know whether to open the black box or not. And this does tie in a little bit to some of the things that we have in a philosophy of science sort of discussion, which is that if you just start opening a black box, you just start picking at random, maybe we'll look at this or maybe we'll look at that. And I'm overgeneralizing, to be sure. But without some sort of structure about what to look for, then what do you look at? This is part of Gehring's criticism about mechanisms, right? It's that if people just, hey, here's a black box, let's see what's in it, it's not clear what advances we get from doing that. And so that's why I would argue that and this is now getting back more towards your question, what I would argue is that the exact time to open a black box is when you have a study that black box is something and you think that there is an important thing missing. So you open the black box at that point and you start focusing in on that thing. Okay, that's my perspective, and that's from a perspective of looking at separation of power sorts of issues. You could do the same thing ignoring the separation of power sorts of issues, just starting from the standpoint of understanding organizations and understanding bureaucracies and understanding public administration. And it's the same, it's sort of what I was talking about earlier, where you might have some model in which you're talking about how bureaucracy operates. Okay, that's fine. You can ask the same question. Are there specific things that we're missing in understanding that? Are we missing things about hierarchy? Are we missing things about expertise? Are we missing things about politicization? But again, by doing that, by starting with these broader, more general things, it gives you a sense of what it is you're going to be looking for. This is just a general observation, I think, about having theory help guide you towards what you're looking at when, you open the black box, there's a lot of interesting things in it. And that's fine, pursue those sorts of things. It also gets back a little bit to the whole forest trees dimension, right? A lot of people think forests are interesting. A lot of people think trees are interesting. A lot of people think leaves are interesting, right? You can keep going down to the cellular structure and things like that. As long as you have, for me, as long as you have some reason that you're focusing on this and you're doing it within the context of some broader schema or explanatory framework, I think you're going to add something new by focusing on that. Okay. Rachel.
So I'm really interested in this comment you made about mechanisms and how we're kind of like have mechanisms all over the board and we're not working cohesively as a field to think about how mechanisms work. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how to coordinate as a discipline in being more systematic in studying mechanisms. Mm-hmm. Or do you think it's not necessary? I don't know.
Yeah, that's, so let me just say a little bit about the way I initially came into that for the talk. There was a chapter by Bert Rockman in a book, I don't know when it was a while ago, which was about the presidency. And Bert mentioned that we have been all taught to salivate, Pavlovian style, about the words theory and rigor. We hear those and we immediately think those are good things. After all, he writes, who wants to claim that they are atheoretical or not very rigorous? I think there's a little bit of that going on right now with mechanisms and micro-foundations. It's something that people turn to very quickly and say, we need to understand these, we need to understand these. I don't think that's wrong. I think that it's really useful to focus on mechanisms, and it can be useful to focus on micro-foundations. I don't think we always need to focus on micro-foundations. Okay? It depends what it is we're trying to explain. If we have opened the black box and we're focusing on mechanisms, then I think there does need to be some discussion about what the relevant mechanisms are. And Gehring approaches this very conceptually from a standpoint of a political theorist. And he's just interested in cataloging all the different ways people think about this. The way that I would think about it is that that's where the people in the subfield need to come to some sort of agreement on what are the appropriate mechanisms that they should be focusing on. So in answer to your question, I do think there needs to be that sort of discussion if we want looking inside the black box to be something that ends up being productive. Otherwise, we end up talking past each other, with some people talking about this mechanism, some talking about this mechanism, and maybe we gain something from putting all of that together, but I think a more focused inquiry on which are the most appropriate mechanisms to focus on would be more beneficial. Yeah.
So I have kind of the converse question of that, which is how do we as a field not discount these descriptive or these explanatory understanding questions if we're spending all of this time focusing on the causal mechanisms? How do we provide incentives when this is what you just kind of call the cool thing to do is to look at the mechanisms?
Yeah. I actually, I find descriptive papers really interesting. I will occasionally get one that it says, here's an interesting thing, let's explore it. And I think that's incredibly valuable. That's not shared by all reviewers. And so what I think needs to happen then, so first of all, in answer to your question, I think that there's no question that these descriptive studies are valuable. So let me give you just one explanation of how that could be. If we start formalizing models of institutions, if we start talking about interactions among different institutions, and there are some gaps in our understanding, we black box bureaucracies or whatever, then what do we look for once we start opening the black box? if there's no description in place already. I think having description in place ends up helping us. So it would be, to me, it would be a complement to these schemas and frameworks is having these descriptions. You can even think about Simon's work. When Simon was writing, he was writing just after a number of other scholars in organization theory and public administration had written a lot of really descriptively rich tomes. Okay, there's people like Luther Gulick and Chester Barnard in particular, who the Human Relations School and Mayo and people like that, in which they were really cataloging all of these things that took place within agencies. And I think that was enormously valuable. And the way that I read Simon's work is that he looked at all of that and said, okay, what do we do with all of that? Because these organizations now, we know they're really complex, but we know there's certain sorts of patterns, like there's authority that emerges. So what does that mean? So Barnard has this very top-down view of authority. Do other people have similar views of authority? He says it's not clear that it should be top-down. And so that leads him then, I think, to start thinking about how cognitive limitations affect how people work in a bureaucracy. But it starts from those earlier descriptive sorts of things. So I think that we need to have some of those things. Now, in terms of, we end up back in a similar sort of problem then, right? I can't say we need those if I'm also saying, well, if we just open the black box, we have some real problems because we don't know what to look for. Obviously, I'm taking a strong point in my talk about the need for these schemas, these frameworks, to know what to look for. In reality, that's part of it. Another part of it is looking at what people on the ground know. The Congress subfield is a great example of this. It tends to, a lot of the literature that came about in the 1990s, that was about the role of congressional committees, and that got really tired about whether is it parties or information or distributive. But for a long time, that was really exciting and really thriving. And a lot of it came about from studies that were really descriptively rich. You know, things like Fenno and things like Manley, where they went in and they looked and they saw and said, let's just talk about it. They didn't just stop there. They said, let's put some context to this and let's try to create a broader picture based on what we've done. But they really were pretty descriptive. Similarly, there were other studies. Joe Cooper has a marvelous history of legislative committees over time, which ends up sounding a whole lot like what Crable ends up writing about, where committees, you know, historically this committee was created here and this one was created here, and what they were doing was they needed somebody to learn about this issue and they needed somebody to specialize, and the floor created this other committee. Sounds an awful lot like the theoretical foundations for what Crable was doing. So I think the same sort of thing goes on in other areas too. Yeah.
So I was interested in like the distinction between a black box and opening a black box, because in a sense, if you're going to categorize something as an agency and say it's a kind of type of thing I don't need to look inside, you need to have some way of identifying it as that kind of thing. So in terms of an intermediate position where you need to have almost like the stickers on the outside of the box, so you can identify and say, okay, that's a regulatory agency. I'm not going to look inside that, but I know it's a regulatory agency.
Yeah.
So you need to have a way of identifying it.
Yeah, so I'll simply concede your point on that. I think that's a really good point, that when we're talking about blackboxing agencies, I'm doing it at the highest level imaginable. But really, we know there are independent agencies and executive branch agencies. And we know there are regulatory agencies and distributive agencies. And I think that maybe by talking about those things, you're opening the black box a little bit to talk about the types of agencies. But you're still then blackboxing those sorts of agencies. Yeah. That's right, yeah, that's right. Maybe they have an opaque top or something like that. I couldn't find a picture of that online. So. Jason.
So I took the second part of your talk as demonstrating that by blackboxing things we can, there's all sorts of downstream benefits and people who do research, and we learn a lot.
Yeah.
What if, and this might be a different way of asking the question that Chris first asked, but what if we black box something and it ends up, and we don't know this, but it ends up being a really poor and influential theory, right?
Yeah.
That then leads us to look at the wrong set of trees in the forest. And so Chris asked, you know, how do you know what black boxes to open, which will be fruitful? We might end up, it might cause us to end up opening a bunch of black boxes and we think they're fruitful, but they're really not. And we've gone down a blind alley, but we don't know.
Yeah. So there's actually, I think I would take there to be two aspects to what you're saying. The one is that by creating a black box, it leads us to conclusions that aren't appropriate, right? And then people start thinking about that framework and moving forward with it, and we get all sorts of work done on something where if we had looked within the black box, we wouldn't have done that. And I think that's actually the approach that some people would take toward some of the structure and process work. It's not my view, but I know that there are very definitely people, for example, in the legal academy who think it's just a mistake. It made no sense to go down that route. It's stuff we knew was in there anyway, and it's just focusing things on all the wrong areas. I think that's something that we need to think about, and I think that sometimes is going to happen when you're trying to combine theory and empirics. The hope is that that doesn't last long, and that people can take from that some of the things that are especially interesting and try to fix the theory. You go back and forth between theory and empirics that way. The second part of what you're saying is if we were to open some of these black boxes and we find, by doing that, we've got these different theories and studies, and we start opening these black boxes and looking inside them, and we start going down the wrong routes with those. We start focusing in on the wrong aspects once we're in there. That one I'm a little bit less concerned about. I am concerned about the first one because I do think that happens. I think there are a lot of models that you read and you just think, no, that's just not, all models are simplifications of reality. That's not an appropriate simplification of reality. It's not capturing the essence of what it is you're trying to do. I'm worried, so that's a worry, okay? And so that's why I think it's really useful to have people who are in an area, people who study bureaucracy, people who study congressional committees, people who study the president, paying attention to these other theoretical things that are going on to sort of perform a check on, no, you're going down the wrong path there. You ought to be pulling it over here. The second one I'm a little bit less worried about, which is opening the black box and focusing on things that are not necessarily going to tell us as much about the general theoretical issues we're wanting to know about. Because you might learn something different, okay? So it might be something where I was talking earlier about you start focusing down and you start focusing on span of control. Okay, this is something that comes from, gosh, I think like Luther Gulick in the 1930s or something. And you can start looking at that and you know what, maybe it's not at all relevant for these things that I'm interested in and that other people are interested in. But it might provide some of that description that you were talking about earlier that could be useful then in other sorts of projects. So I'm a little bit less worried about that, a little bit more worried about the first part of it. Susan.
So what's the black box that we most need to open?
For me, the thing that I keep coming back to, there's so lots of different things that I think have been open to wonderful effects in recent years. The one that I keep thinking about and that I keep looking for is more about hierarchy within agencies. There has been some work on this, obviously, and it's been really interesting. You can go back to Terry's 1985 paper. Dan Carpenter, in his paper on the FDA, has this, it's a signaling model of how the budget matters. And it's not the main part of what he does, but he allows information about hierarchy to emerge from the data in the method. And I would love to see more of that, because from both Terry's paper and Dan's paper, we get a really strong sense that hierarchy is going to matter for how responsive agencies are to what others outside of the agency are pushing them to do. It can be a really protective sort of thing. It can also, I would imagine, lead to inefficiencies. Or it could lead to strategic behavior, to slow walking, for example, if it has to go through multiple layers. So that, for me, would be the thing that I would love to see more work on.
Well, please join me in thanking the 2018 Herbert Simon Award winner. We look forward to more Shipan and Simon sites.
Thank you.
Congratulations.